In 1909, the most expensive private residence in New York was not on Fifth Avenue, where Vanderbilts and Astors maintained their marble palaces. It was a 100,000 square foot granite fortress perched 1,300 feet above the Hudson Valley on a mountain that had been dynamited into submission. The house belonged to Edward Henry Harriman, a railroad magnate who controlled more track mileage than any man in America. Critics called it a monument to American craftsmanship. Architects praised its scale and ambition. The reality was more complicated. Harriman had spent 4 years and millions of dollars blasting a 50-acre plateau from solid rock, hauling materials up impossible slopes, and commissioning sculptures from the nation's finest artists. He had employed hundreds of workers whose names were never recorded. Some of them fell from scaffolding or were caught in blasting accidents. Their deaths were noted briefly, if at all. The construction consumed approximately $2 million in an era when that sum could purchase a dozen Fifth Avenue mansions. The annual maintenance required another $200,000. In today's currency, those figures represent roughly $60 million for construction and $6 million annually to operate. Harriman lived in his palace for 3 months before he died. His widow inherited the estate and immediately understood what her husband apparently had not. The house was unsustainable. She donated 10,000 acres to the state within a year. She used the mansion seasonally rather than year-round. She passed it to her son as a wedding gift while continuing to occupy part of it herself. The pattern was clear. No one wanted full responsibility for what Harriman had built. 41 years after completion, the Harriman family gave the entire estate to Columbia University. The transaction was described as philanthropic donation. The reality was surrender. The family could find no buyer for a mansion that cost a fortune to heat, required a staff of 70, and served no practical purpose. Columbia accepted reluctantly and maintained it for 55 years at continuous financial loss. In 2007, the university sold it to a conservation organization. In 2011, that organization sold it to a Chinese-backed nonprofit. The palace has defeated every owner. Some called it American excellence. Others saw monstrous excess that destroyed a mountain and killed workers whose names were never recorded. The estate represented Gilded Age ambition at its most extreme, so expensive that even railroad millions could not sustain it. If you're fascinated by mansions that consumed fortunes and the true cost of building palaces, subscribe. Tell me in the comments which Gilded Age estate we should investigate next. Now, let's discover how railroad wealth built a kingdom no one could keep. Chapter 1. The Railroad Fortune. Edward Henry Harriman was born in 1848 in Hempstead, New York, the son of an Episcopal clergyman who possessed respectability but no wealth. The family occupied the uncomfortable middle tier of American society. They were not poor, but they possessed none of the advantages that smoothed the path for children of prosperous families. There was no money for university education. There were no family connections to secure positions with established firms. Whatever Edward Harriman would become, he would have to build it himself. He quit school at age 14 to work as an errand boy on Wall Street. His uncle Oliver Harriman had established a career there and helped secure the position. The work was menial, running messages between offices, fetching documents, making deliveries. But it provided access to the financial district and observation of how wealth actually operated. By age 22, Harriman had purchased a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. He had saved aggressively and borrowed where necessary. He understood that access to the exchange meant access to capital, and capital meant opportunity. In 1879, at age 31, Harriman married Mary Williamson Averill. The marriage was more than romantic. Mary's father, William J. Averill, was president of the Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain Railroad. The connection introduced Harriman to railroad operations and the men who controlled them. He studied the industry systematically. He learned how routes were structured, how freight rates were calculated, how profit margins were determined. He noticed which lines prospered and which struggled. By 1881, Harriman was ready to test what he had learned. The Lake Ontario Southern Railroad was bankrupt, its equipment deteriorating and its creditors demanding payment. Harriman purchased it for approximately $50,000. He renamed it the Sodus Bay and Southern. He reorganized the management, negotiated with creditors, and sold it to the Pennsylvania Railroad at substantial profit within 2 years. The transaction established a pattern he would repeat for the rest of his career. Find broken systems, reorganize them, extract value, move to the next opportunity. The 1880s and 1890s saw Harriman acquiring control of increasingly important rail lines. He specialized in rescuing bankrupt operations that other investors avoided. Railroads required enormous capital and generated fierce competition. Lines extended credit to customers who could not pay. They built routes that duplicated existing service. They engaged in rate wars that destroyed profit margins. Poorly managed companies collapsed regularly. Harriman understood that broken railroads could be made profitable through ruthless efficiency and strategic consolidation. In 1897, at age 49, Harriman became a director of the Union Pacific Railroad. The line had gone bankrupt during the financial panic of 1893. Its reputation was damaged. Its physical infrastructure was deteriorating. Most investors considered it a poor prospect. Harriman saw opportunity where others saw only risk. By 1898, he was chairman of the executive committee. By 1903, he had assumed the presidency. Under his management, Union Pacific was reorganized, refinanced, and restored to profitability. The company that had been considered nearly worthless became one of the most valuable railroad properties in America. Harriman's methods were neither gentle nor democratic. He cut wages when necessary. He extended working hours. He eliminated unprofitable routes without regard for the communities they served. He negotiated with competitors from positions of strength and exploited weakness wherever he found it. Workers who attempted to organize faced immediate dismissal. Towns that demanded lower freight rates faced service reductions. The railroad operated according to principles that maximized profit and minimized constraint. Harriman made no apologies. In 1901, Harriman acquired control of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The line connected California to Texas and Louisiana. Combined with Union Pacific, Harriman now controlled a transcontinental system extending from Oregon to the Gulf Coast. The scope of his empire was unprecedented. He commanded more track mileage than any individual in American history. He could move freight across the western United States without relying on competitors. The power was immense. The consolidation made Harriman extraordinarily wealthy. His fortune grew from the millions he had accumulated through earlier deals to an estimated $70 million to $100 million by the time of his death. Contemporary observers struggled to comprehend such sums. The average American worker earned perhaps $500 annually. Harriman's wealth represented the lifetime earnings of 200,000 workers. He had built his fortune through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations. But wealth on such scale attracted attention. Progressive reformers were beginning to challenge the power of railroad barons. Newspapers criticized the monopolies that controlled transportation. Politicians proposed regulations limiting rate increases and requiring service standards. Harriman fought these efforts through every available channel. He lobbied legislators. He funded political campaigns. He used his control of transportation to pressure communities that supported reform. The battles consumed time and energy. They also reminded him that even immense wealth could not purchase immunity from public scrutiny. By the mid-1900s, Harriman was approaching 60. He had achieved financial success beyond what his childhood circumstances had suggested was possible. He controlled a railroad empire. He possessed wealth that placed him among the richest men in America, but he had spent decades managing businesses and fighting competitors. He had operated according to principles of constant expansion and ruthless efficiency. He had built something impressive and exhausting. Now he wanted something different. Harriman wanted land. He wanted privacy. He wanted a physical monument to what he had achieved that would outlast the railroad empire. He wanted something permanent in a world where businesses rose and fell according to market forces. He did not yet understand that permanence came with costs even his fortune could not indefinitely sustain. But that realization lay in the future. For now, in the mid-1880s, he had found property that captured his imagination. In 1886, an opportunity appeared that would consume the final decades of his life and millions of his fortune. Chapter 2. The Mountain Purchase. In 1886, the Parrott family estate in Orange County came up for auction. The property consisted of 7,863 acres of forested mountains in the Ramapo Highlands. The land had previously served as iron ore source, for the Parrott Brothers Iron Works. The foundry where young Harriman had worked as a boy stood on adjacent property. He understood the terrain. He bid $52,500 and won. The estate had been named Arden by its previous owner, Peter Parrott, after his wife Mary Antoinette Arden. The property extended across steep ridges covered in dense forest. Streams cut through ravines. The Ramapo River flowed through the valley below. The land was beautiful in the way that made development difficult and privacy absolute. Harriman wanted both qualities. The purchase on September 17, 1886, was modest by the standards of what would follow. In today's currency, $52,500 represents approximately $1.4 million. For nearly 8,000 acres, the price was reasonable. But Harriman had no intention of stopping at the original boundaries. Over the next 2 decades, he systematically purchased every adjacent parcel that came available. He bought land from farmers who could no longer make payments. He negotiated with estates, settling debts. He acquired property from speculators who had overextended themselves. By the early 1900s, Harriman owned approximately 40,000 acres. The land acquisition cost several $100,000 beyond the initial purchase. The exact figure was never recorded publicly, but contemporary estimates suggested Harriman had invested between $300,000 and $500,000 in assembling the complete estate. He had purchased roughly 40 separate parcels. Some transactions were simple. Others required months of negotiation. Harriman approached land accumulation with the same systematic efficiency he brought to railroad consolidation. Once he controlled sufficient acreage, Harriman began developing infrastructure. He commissioned the construction of 40 miles of bridle paths through the forest. The paths were graded carefully to allow comfortable riding. They connected different sections of the property and provided access to locations that would have been unreachable otherwise. Harriman rode these paths regularly, exploring his domain and evaluating potential building sites. The search for the ideal location took years. Harriman wanted elevation for views and privacy. He wanted proximity to water. He wanted a site that announced dominance over the landscape. He rode through the property in different seasons, observing how light fell across the ridges and how weather patterns affected different elevations. The process was methodical and unhurried. He had time and resources. He would find the perfect location. By 1905, Harriman had made his decision. The site was atop Mount Orama, a ridge rising steeply from the Ramapo Valley. The elevation was approximately 1,300 feet. On one side, the valley extended below. On the other, Forest Lake and Cranberry Lake nestled in wooded ravines. The location commanded views in multiple directions. It was exposed enough to feel monumental, but protected enough to provide shelter from winter winds. The site presented extraordinary construction challenges. The ridge was narrow. The slope was steep. The summit consisted of solid granite. Building on such terrain would require extensive preparation. Conventional construction methods would not work. The foundation would need to be carved from rock. Materials would need to be hauled up slopes that defeated conventional wagons. Any structure built here would cost multiples of what similar buildings cost on flat land. Harriman apparently viewed the challenges as advantages. The difficulty of the site guaranteed that no one else would attempt anything similar. The expense ensured exclusivity. The engineering problems would demonstrate that wealth could overcome any obstacle. He wanted a house that announced its owner's power to reshape nature itself. The granite ridge would provide opportunity to make that statement. The decision was made. The location was selected. The engineering challenges were acknowledged and accepted. By 1905, Harriman was ready to commission architects and begin planning a house that would justify the 2 decades he had spent assembling the land beneath it. The estate had cost perhaps $800,000 to acquire and develop. The house would cost considerably more. The architectural firm Harriman chose had designed mansions for New York's elite, but they had never attempted anything like what Harriman proposed. Chapter 3. The Architects and the Impossible Design. Carrere and Hastings arrived at Arden in 1905 with portfolios that impressed Harriman. The firm had designed the New York Public Library. They had built mansions for Whitneys and Vanderbilts. They specialized in Beaux-Arts grandeur, executed with impeccable taste. John Mervyn Carrere and Thomas Hastings were among the most respected architects in America, but they had never designed a house that required dynamiting a mountain before laying foundations. Harriman's requirements were specific and unconventional. The house should be approximately 100,000 square feet. Every material should be American. Every craftsman should be American. No European imports would be permitted. The decision was deliberate. Other Gilded Age millionaires filled their houses with French furniture and Italian marble. They hired European craftsmen and imported architectural elements from demolished castles. Harriman wanted to demonstrate that American materials and American labor could create something equal to anything Europe offered. The rejection of European imports was unusual enough to attract comment. Most wealthy Americans during this period viewed European goods as inherently superior to domestic products. Furniture from Paris, marble from Carrara, tapestries from Brussels, these were markers of refined taste. Harriman's insistence on American-only materials suggested either patriotic principle or calculated differentiation from his peers. The result would be the same, regardless of motive. Arden House would be entirely American in materials and execution. Carrere and Hastings developed designs following Harriman's requirements. The house would be U-shaped with a central courtyard. The exterior would feature gray granite, quarried from the estate itself. The style would be American Beaux-Arts, incorporating elements of French chateau architecture but executed with distinctly American scale and materials. The building would rise 2.5 to 3.5 stories depending on the section, with additional attic spaces. The footprint would be massive. The interior specifications were equally ambitious. The main floor would include a music room modeled after a medieval great hall. The room would be large enough to seat 200 people. An organ would be installed in a loft at one end. A massive fireplace would anchor the opposite end. Corridors would surround a central courtyard featuring a fountain, sculpture, and plantings. The design created interior spaces that functioned almost as outdoor areas, bringing light and air into the center of the enormous structure. The second floor would contain family bedrooms and guest suites. The final count would reach 97 bedrooms when additions were completed in later years. Even the initial design called for dozens of guest rooms. Harriman apparently anticipated hosting visitors for extended stays. The house was designed not merely as a private residence, but as a venue for entertaining on a scale that few private homes attempted. The art program Harriman commissioned added substantially to costs. He hired American sculptors to create work specifically for Arden. James Earl Fraser would create a bas-relief portrait of Harriman over one of the main fireplaces and a fountain for the interior courtyard. Malvina Hoffman would create a bust of Mary Harriman. Charles Carey Rumsey would design a fountain featuring 3 graces, a marble fireplace surround with a caricature of architect Thomas Hastings, and corbel carvings of bighorn sheep for the music room. The commissions were substantial and expensive. The practical challenges of construction dominated planning discussions. The site required removing approximately 50 acres of mountaintop to create a plateau suitable for the house and its immediate grounds. The removal would require hundreds of tons of dynamite. The blasting would take months and would permanently alter the mountain's profile. The debris would need to be moved down the slopes or used as fill. The scale of site preparation exceeded anything Carrere and Hastings had previously encountered. Materials would need to be hauled up a mountain that rose 1,300 feet from the valley floor. Conventional wagons could not manage the grade. Harriman proposed building a cog railway specifically for construction purposes. The railway would run from the base of the mountain to the building site, using a rack and pinion system to manage the steep slope. The railway itself would cost tens of thousands of dollars and would serve no purpose after construction was complete. Harriman considered it necessary. A conventional carriage road would also be built, following a meandering route approximately 3 miles long that gained elevation gradually enough for horse-drawn vehicles to manage. The road would allow the family to reach the house after the construction railway was removed. The road construction required extensive grading and would add further costs. Early estimates suggested the house itself might cost $500,000 to $1 million. The site preparation, railway, roads, and infrastructure would add several $100,000 more. The commissions for art and sculpture would continue accumulating costs. The furnishings would require additional expenditure after construction was complete. A realistic total budget approached $2 million to $3 million. In today's currency, that represents approximately $60 million to $90 million. Harriman approved the plans without apparent concern about the costs. The drawings were complete. The contracts were signed. The mountain awaited. By summer 1905, the destruction was ready to begin. The first explosions echoed through the Ramapo Valley in June 1905. Chapter 4. Building the Palace. The first task was removing 50 acres of mountain. Workers drilled holes into solid rock and packed them with dynamite. The explosions began in summer 1905 and continued for months. Rock fragments rained down the mountainside. Dust clouds obscured the valley below. The destruction was visible for miles. No one counted how many tons of mountain were blasted into rubble or how many workers were injured in the process. The labor force assembled for the project numbered approximately 200 to 300 workers at peak periods. Most were immigrants. Irish workers handled masonry. Italian laborers performed general construction. Polish workers operated as day laborers, handling the most dangerous tasks. The workforce operated 6 days weekly, hours extended from dawn to dusk, typically 10 to 12 hours daily, depending on season and available light. Wages reflected the hierarchy of skill and ethnicity. Skilled masons earned $3 to $4 daily. Carpenters received similar wages. General laborers earned $1.50 to $2. Workers handling the most dangerous tasks, including blasting operations, sometimes received slightly higher pay to compensate for the risk. The wages were typical for large construction projects of the era. They were also barely sufficient to support families. Workers who were injured or killed received no compensation. Their families received nothing. The blasting operations were extraordinarily dangerous. Workers drilled holes into granite using hand tools and black powder charges. The holes were packed with dynamite. Fuses were lit and workers retreated to positions that were supposed to provide safety. The supposed safety was imperfect. Flying rock struck workers regularly. Some injuries were minor cuts and bruises. Others were serious fractures or head trauma. At least several workers died during the blasting operations. Their names were not recorded. No investigation followed any death. Work continued the same day. The cog railway construction proceeded simultaneously with the blasting. The railway required building a track up the mountain using a rack and pinion system. The grade in some sections exceeded 15 degrees. Workers built wooden trestles where terrain required it. They cut into the mountainside where necessary. The railway was functional but crude. It served one purpose only: hauling materials to the construction site. Small engines pulled cars loaded with stone, timber, steel, cement, and equipment up the mountain. By late 1905, sufficient blasting was complete to begin foundation excavation. The plateau had been created through removal of rock and earth, but foundations still required excavation into remaining stone. Workers used picks, bars, and additional blasting to create trenches for concrete footings. The excavation proceeded slowly through winter 1905 and into spring 1906. Cold weather complicated the concrete work. Frozen ground resisted excavation. The schedule slipped repeatedly. Foundation construction began in earnest during 1906. Concrete was mixed on site using sand and aggregate hauled up the mountain. The mixing was manual. Workers shoveled materials into bins, added water, and mixed by hand. The physical labor was exhausting. The foundations required thousands of cubic yards of concrete. Each cubic yard represented hours of manual work. The foundations took most of 1906 to complete. The steel framework arrived in sections during 1907. Each section had been fabricated in Pennsylvania according to specifications. The steel was hauled up the mountain on the cog railway. Erecting the framework required positioning heavy beams at heights up to 40 feet. Workers operated from wooden scaffolding. They used block and tackle systems to lift beams into position. They bolted connections while standing on beams with minimal safety equipment. A worker fell from the steel framework in May 1907. He was positioning a beam on the second floor when his footing gave way. The fall was approximately 25 feet onto the concrete foundation below. He died within minutes. His body was removed. Work continued that afternoon. His name has been lost. His family received no compensation. No changes were made to safety procedures. The granite work began after the steel framework was substantially complete. The granite came from the estate itself. Quarries had been opened in areas where the stone was suitable quality. Workers cut blocks, using hand tools and black powder. The blocks were hauled to the construction site on the cog railway. Masons shaped each block to specifications and set it in mortar. The work required precision and strength. Each block weighed hundreds of pounds. Setting them at height required scaffolding and physical endurance. The masonry work continued through 1907 and 1908. The exterior walls rose slowly. The building's massive scale meant that even rapid progress appeared slow. Masons worked in summer heat exceeding 95 degrees. They worked in winter cold that froze mortar and made stone brittle. The conditions were brutal. Men in their 30s aged visibly. By their 40s, most could no longer perform the work. Younger men replaced them. Interior work began while exterior construction continued. Plasterers worked on ceilings and walls. Carpenters installed framework for floors and interior walls. Electricians ran wiring for lighting and power. Plumbers installed pipes for water and heating systems. The house would have central heating using coal-fired boilers. Every room would have electric lighting. Indoor plumbing would serve every floor. The mechanical systems alone cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The woodwork installation proceeded through 1908 and into 1909. Skilled carpenters installed paneling, trim, doors, and built-in furniture. The wood came from American forests. Oak, walnut, and mahogany were selected for different applications. The craftsmanship was exceptional. The woodwork would be among the most admired features of the completed house. It also consumed months of skilled labor and added substantially to costs. The commissioned artwork was installed as spaces became ready. James Earl Fraser's bas-relief of Harriman went above a main fireplace. The portrait showed Harriman in profile, capturing his determination and intensity. Malvina Hoffman's bust of Mary Harriman was positioned prominently. Charles Carey Rumsey's sculptures were installed in designated locations. The Three Graces fountain became a centerpiece. The art program was completed according to specifications. By July 1909, the mansion's exterior was essentially complete. Brickwork was finished. The roof was on. Windows were installed. The interior work was approaching completion. Plaster was finished. Flooring was installed. Woodwork was complete. Mechanical systems were operational. Electrical wiring was installed and tested. Plumbing was functional. The house was nearly ready for occupancy. The costs had exceeded every estimate. The final expenditure was somewhere between $1.5 million and $2 million for the house alone. Additional millions had been spent on the cog railway, the carriage road, site preparation, and landscaping. The total approached or exceeded $3 million. In today's currency, that represents approximately $90 million. Harriman had built the most expensive private residence in New York and one of the most expensive in the nation. He moved in during summer 1909. On September 9, 1909, Edward Henry Harriman died at Arden at age 61. Chapter 5. The Brief Occupancy and the Widow's Inheritance. Edward Henry Harriman died at Arden House on September 9, 1909, at 1:30 in the afternoon. He was 61 years old. He had spent approximately 3 months living in the mansion that had consumed 4 years of construction and millions of dollars. The official cause of death was recorded as intestinal ailment. Contemporary accounts suggested stomach cancer was likely. The specific diagnosis mattered less than the timing. Harriman had barely enjoyed what he had built. His widow, Mary Averill Harriman, was 58 years old when she inherited the estate. She had been married to Edward for 30 years. She had watched him build his railroad empire. She had supported his decision to purchase Arden. She had participated in planning the house, but she had not anticipated becoming sole proprietor of a property that required a fortune merely to maintain. The inheritance was substantial. Harriman's estate was valued at approximately $70 million to $100 million. The fortune included railroad stock, real estate holdings, cash assets, and Arden itself. Mary and the 4 children were well provided for by any measure, but Arden House presented unique challenges that wealth alone could not solve. The operational costs became apparent immediately. The house required a staff of approximately 50 to 70 people to maintain and operate. A butler managed household operations. Maids cleaned the immense interior. Cooks prepared meals. Groundskeepers maintained 450 acres of immediate estate grounds. Engineers operated the private power and water systems. The payroll alone approached $100,000 annually. Additional costs included fuel, supplies, maintenance, property taxes, and repairs. Total annual costs were estimated at $150,000 to $200,000. In today's currency, that represents approximately $4.5 million to $6 million yearly. Mary understood immediately that the house was unsustainable as a year-round residence. Heating 100,000 square feet through a New York winter was prohibitively expensive. Operating full staff continuously made no sense for a widow and occasional family visits. She made practical decisions quickly. The house would be used seasonally rather than year-round. Staff would be reduced to minimal caretakers during months when the family was not in residence. Expenses would be controlled where possible. But some costs could not be avoided. The building required constant maintenance regardless of occupancy. The mechanical systems needed monitoring. The roof required inspection and repair. The stonework needed pointing. The woodwork required care. Neglect would result in deterioration that would cost far more to repair than ongoing maintenance. Mary allocated funds for essential upkeep and deferred what could be deferred. In 1910, Mary made a strategic decision that reduced immediate burdens. She donated 10,000 acres of the Arden estate to New York State, along with $1 million in endowment funds. The donation established Harriman State Park. The gift was presented as philanthropic gesture, honoring her late husband's memory. It was also practical surrender. Mary could not afford to maintain 40,000 acres. The property taxes alone were substantial. Reducing the holdings to the house and approximately 450 immediate acres made the estate more manageable. The donation was celebrated publicly. Newspapers praised Mary's generosity. State officials expressed gratitude. A park serving the public was created through private philanthropy. The coverage never mentioned that Mary had given away land she could not afford to keep. The narrative of generous donation served everyone's interests better than acknowledging the financial pressure that motivated it. Mary's 4 children were entering adulthood during this period. W. Averell Harriman, the eldest son, was born in 1891. He graduated from Yale in 1913 and entered the banking business. E. Rowland Harriman was born in 1895 and would follow his brother into finance. The 2 daughters married into prominent families. The children had absorbed their father's ambition and their mother's practicality. They understood that Arden represented both asset and liability. Mary continued using Arden as a summer retreat through the 1910s and into the 1920s. She entertained guests. She maintained family traditions. She fulfilled the social obligations of her position. But she never lived at Arden full-time. The house was too large and too expensive for one person. It had been designed for a railroad baron at the peak of his power who wanted to impress visitors and demonstrate his wealth. Mary was a widow managing an inheritance. The house no longer matched its owner's circumstances. By 1915, Mary had made a decision that would shape Arden's future for decades. Chapter 6: The Son's Inheritance and the Growing Burden. In 1915, Mary Harriman gave Arden House to her eldest son, W. Averell Harriman, as a wedding gift. He was 24 years old and marrying Kitty Lanier Lawrence. The gift appeared generous. The reality was more complicated. Mary continued living in the West Wing until her death in 1932. Averell inherited the title to property his mother still occupied and the financial obligation to maintain a house that consumed his inheritance faster than his investments could replenish it. Averell had graduated from Yale University in 1913. He had entered the banking business immediately, working with his brother Rowland to establish what would become Brown Brothers, Harriman & Co. The firm prospered. Averell accumulated substantial wealth independent of his inheritance. He could afford Arden's costs theoretically, but the practical reality of maintaining a 100,000 square foot mansion as a private residence grew more difficult with each passing year. The marriage to Kitty Lanier Lawrence lasted until 1929, when they divorced. Averell married his second wife, Marie Norton Whitney, in 1930. Marie had left her husband, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, to be with Averell. The scandal attracted attention in society circles where such transitions were noted carefully. The Arden estate provided a retreat from public scrutiny in a setting that announced Averell's position among America's elite families. During the 1920s, Averell commissioned construction of an East Wing addition to Arden House. The addition provided additional guest rooms and staff quarters. The expansion cost tens of thousands of dollars. It also increased the operating burden. More rooms meant more maintenance, more heating costs, more staff requirements. Averill apparently believed the improvements were necessary. The additions were completed according to specifications. The annual costs of maintaining Arden continued at levels approximating what Mary had faced. Staff payroll, utilities, maintenance, property taxes, and supplies consumed $150,000 to $200,000 yearly through the 1920s. Averill had sufficient income to cover the costs, but the expense was constant and growing. Labor costs were rising. Material costs were increasing. The house that had cost millions to build was costing hundreds of thousands annually to maintain. Averill's career was expanding during this period. He served in various business capacities. He developed interests in transportation and shipping beyond his banking activities. He was entering political circles and cultivating relationships that would later support his transition into public service. Arden provided a venue for entertaining business associates and political contacts. The house served a purpose beyond mere residence. In 1932, Mary Harriman died. She had continued occupying the west wing of Arden House for 17 years after giving the property to Averill. Her death removed the complication of dual occupancy. It also removed the matriarch who had maintained continuity with Edward's original vision. Averill was now fully responsible for Arden without his mother's presence to justify maintaining it. The 1930s brought additional challenges. The Great Depression had destroyed many American fortunes. The Harriman wealth survived largely intact because it was diversified and conservatively managed. But the economic climate made maintaining expensive estates increasingly difficult to justify. Servants who had been plentiful and affordable in the 1920s were less available in the 1930s, even as unemployment was high. The economics of private estates were changing. Averill used Arden increasingly sporadically through the 1930s. He maintained it sufficiently to prevent deterioration. He used it for weekend retreats and occasional entertaining. But the house was no longer anyone's primary residence. The seasonal use pattern Mary had established became more pronounced. The estate was occupied perhaps 3 to 4 months annually at most. The rest of the time it sat largely empty while staff maintained it. When America entered World War II in 1941, Averill was serving in various government capacities. He would eventually serve as ambassador to the Soviet Union and later to Great Britain. His public service made maintaining Arden as a private retreat impossible and inappropriate. In 1942, Averill and his brother Roland offered Arden House to the United States Navy. The Navy accepted and converted Arden into a convalescent hospital for wounded servicemen. The conversion was modeled on similar facilities that had been established in England and Russia. The Navy added medical facilities, modified rooms for hospital use, and installed equipment necessary for patient care. The house served as a convalescent hospital from 1942 until 1945. Hundreds of servicemen recovered there. The loan to the Navy was presented as patriotic contribution. It was also practical relief from maintenance costs. The Navy paid minimal rent, if any. But the Navy also maintained the property and bore operating costs. Averill was relieved of the annual burden for the duration of the war. The arrangement benefited all parties. When the war ended in 1945, the Navy returned Arden House to the Harriman family. The building had been modified for medical use. Equipment had been installed and removed. Wear and tear was evident. Returning the house to residential condition would require substantial renovation and expense. Averill faced a decision. He could invest in restoration and resume using Arden as a private estate. Or he could find an alternative use that relieved him of the financial burden his father had created and his grandmother had attempted to manage. By 1949, Averill Harriman and his brother Roland faced an impossible choice. They could not sell the estate. They could not afford to keep it. There was only one option remaining. Chapter 7. The Donation as Surrender. In 1950, W. Averill Harriman and his brother E. Roland Harriman deeded Arden House and 450 remaining acres to Columbia University. The press release described it as a generous donation to establish the American Assembly, a public policy institute founded by Dwight D. Eisenhower. The reality was simpler. The brothers could find no buyer for a 100,000 square foot mansion requiring $200,000 annually to maintain. Columbia accepted the property reluctantly. understanding that refusing would insult a powerful political family whose continued support the university valued more than the estate itself. The American Assembly was a legitimate institution. Eisenhower, then president of Columbia University, had founded it as a venue for bringing together leaders from business, government, and academia to discuss policy issues. The concept was sound. The need for a physical location was genuine. But Arden House was not chosen because it was the ideal facility for such purposes. It was chosen because the Harriman brothers needed to dispose of it, and Columbia could not easily refuse the donation. The property transferred to Columbia included approximately 450 acres. This was the remainder of the original 7,863-acre purchase, after multiple reductions. The vast majority of the Arden estate had been given to New York State for parkland. What remained was the mansion, its immediate grounds, and sufficient land to provide privacy and setting. Even this reduced holding represented substantial financial obligation. Columbia's acceptance committed the university to maintaining a property that would require constant subsidies. The donation included no endowment for operations. The university would need to fund maintenance, staffing, utilities, and repairs from general funds, or find ways to generate revenue from the property. The challenge was substantial. The university's initial response was converting Arden into a conference center. The mansion's scale and remote location made it suitable for hosting extended conferences and executive education programs. Columbia added a north wing with classrooms and meeting spaces. An auditorium was attached to the west wing. The additions cost hundreds of thousands of dollars but made the facility functional for its new purpose. Arden House became operational as a conference center in 1951. The designation as America's first conference center was accurate. No other institution had previously converted a private mansion into a dedicated facility for conferences and executive education. The concept was innovative. The execution was expensive. Operating costs remained substantial. The building required heating through winter. Staff needed to maintain the facility and serve conference guests. Food service was necessary. The infrastructure needed constant maintenance. Annual costs approached $150,000 to $250,000 through the 1950s and 1960s. Revenue from conference bookings covered some expenses but rarely approached total costs. Columbia subsidized the operations continuously. The conference center attracted business school programs, corporate retreats, and government meetings. The setting was impressive. The facilities were adequate. But the location 40 miles from Manhattan was inconvenient. Conference attendees needed to travel to a remote mountain rather than staying in accessible Manhattan hotels. The inconvenience limited bookings. In 1966, Arden House was designated a National Historic Landmark. The recognition acknowledged the architectural and historical significance. The mansion represented an important example of American Beaux-Arts design. It demonstrated American craftsmanship at the highest level. The Commission of American Artists added cultural value. The designation was appropriate and prestigious. The landmark status also created obligations. Columbia could not modify the building significantly without approval from preservation authorities. Routine maintenance needed to respect historic features. Deferred maintenance could result in landmark status being revoked. The recognition was honor and constraint simultaneously. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Columbia continued operating Arden as a conference center. The facility hosted thousands of participants annually. Executive education programs used it regularly. The American Assembly continued holding sessions there. But the financial model never achieved sustainability. Revenue consistently fell short of operating costs. The university subsidy continued year after year. By the 1990s, operating costs had escalated substantially. Heating a 100,000-square-foot building now cost hundreds of thousands annually. Labor costs had increased dramatically from earlier decades. The mechanical systems were aging and requiring expensive repairs or replacement. Annual costs approached $500,000 or more. Revenue from conference operations covered perhaps 60 to 70% of expenses. The gap persisted. The conference center market had also changed. Competition had increased as hotels and dedicated conference facilities had proliferated. Corporate clients had more options. Universities had built their own conference facilities. Arden's isolation, once viewed as advantage providing privacy and focus, became disadvantage in an era when participants expected convenient access to restaurants, entertainment, and urban amenities. Columbia began questioning whether maintaining Arden made sense. The university had subsidized operations for 5 decades. The cumulative cost had reached many millions of dollars. The facility served legitimate purposes, but was it worth the continuing expense? Alternative uses were explored. None seemed viable. The house was too specialized and too expensive for most institutions or commercial operators to use profitably. In 2005, Columbia made the decision to cease conference center operations. Arden House would be closed. Minimum maintenance would continue to preserve the structure, but active operations would stop. The university would seek a buyer willing to take on the property. The 55-year experiment in institutional ownership was ending. Finding a buyer proved as difficult as the Harriman brothers had discovered. The house was too large for private ownership. Operating costs were prohibitive. The historic landmark status limited modifications. Commercial uses were restricted. The location was too remote for most purposes. Columbia listed the property and waited. No acceptable offers materialized. By 2007, Columbia had carried the Arden burden for 57 years. The university wanted out. The question was who would be willing to take on what the Harrimans and Columbia both had found unsustainable. The answer came from an unexpected source. Chapter 8. The Final Transfers and Continuing Crisis. In 2007, the Open Space Institute purchased Arden House and 450 acres from Columbia University for $4 million. The conservation organization planned to preserve the land and find a suitable buyer for the mansion. The institute understood what Columbia had learned. Arden House was unsellable. No individual wanted a 100,000-square-foot mansion requiring hundreds of thousands annually in maintenance. No commercial entity could adapt the building profitably. The estate that E.H. Harriman had built for $2 million had become a white elephant no one wanted for any price. The Open Space Institute specialized in land conservation. The organization had protected thousands of acres in New York and surrounding states. Acquiring Arden allowed the institute to place a conservation easement on 450 acres adjacent to Harriman State Park. The easement prevented development permanently. The land would remain forested. The conservation goal was achieved through the purchase. But the mansion presented a different challenge. The institute had no interest in operating a conference center or maintaining a historic house. The organization's mission focused on land protection, not building management. The plan was straightforward: preserve the land, sell the building to someone willing to maintain it appropriately, move on to the next conservation project. The mansion was listed for sale in 2007. The listing price was not publicly disclosed but was reportedly in the range of $6 million to $8 million. The price reflected the property's size, condition, and historical significance. It also reflected the enormous costs that any buyer would face. For 3 years, Arden House remained on the market. No buyers appeared. The difficulty was fundamental. Private individuals did not want houses of this scale. Maintaining Arden required wealth far beyond what most successful people possessed. Even billionaires avoided properties with such extreme operating costs. The house was too large for family use and too expensive to maintain as an occasional retreat. Commercial buyers faced different obstacles. Converting Arden to hotel use would require extensive modifications that historic landmark status made difficult or impossible. Operating as a conference center had proven financially unsustainable for Columbia. Other commercial uses were restricted by location and landmark protections. No viable business model presented itself. In 2011, after 4 years of unsuccessful marketing, the Open Space Institute found a buyer. The Research Center on Natural Conservation, Incorporated, purchased Arden House for $6.5 million. The organization was a Chinese-backed nonprofit with stated goals of discovering innovative conservation methods, organizing environmental forums, and studying climate change effects. The center identified itself as ideal steward for the property because of its conservation mission and capacity to maintain both land and historic buildings. The sale was completed with the conservation easement intact. The 450 acres remained protected from development. The mansion would continue functioning as a conference center. The research center planned to upgrade facilities and expand operations. The property would serve environmental conferences, research gatherings, and educational programs. The vision aligned with Harriman's original intention of creating something impressive that served important purposes. The research center began operations immediately. The 97 guest rooms were renovated. Conference facilities were upgraded. The building received necessary maintenance. Staff was hired. The center began booking conferences and events. Operations resumed after the years when Columbia had allowed bookings to cease, but the fundamental challenges remained. Operating a 100,000 square foot mansion on a remote mountaintop was prohibitively expensive, regardless of the owner. Heating costs alone consumed hundreds of thousands annually. Staffing required dozens of employees. Maintenance was constant. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, and supplies added to the burden. Annual costs reportedly approached $300,000 to $500,000 or more. Conference revenue proved as unpredictable for the research center as it had been for Columbia. Some years brought robust bookings. Other years were lean. The conference business was competitive and sensitive to economic conditions. Corporate budgets fluctuated. Academic conferences faced funding constraints. The remote location continued to be both selling point and obstacle. In 2015, the Research Center on Natural Conservation purchased the New York Military Academy, a bankrupt educational institution. The acquisition suggested a pattern of acquiring struggling properties. Whether this represented strategic vision or opportunistic purchasing was unclear. What was clear was that the organization had taken on multiple properties with substantial financial obligations. The COVID-19 pandemic devastated the conference business in 2020. Travel restrictions prevented gatherings. Corporate conferences were canceled. Educational programs moved online. Arden House sat largely empty during a period when operating costs continued but revenue disappeared. The financial impact was severe. How the research center managed this crisis was not publicly disclosed. The current status of Arden House operations is uncertain. The property continues functioning as a conference center officially. Bookings can be made through the organization's website, but the long-term financial sustainability remains questionable. The research center is the third institutional owner to struggle with maintaining what Harriman created. The pattern suggests the problem is inherent rather than situational. No entity has successfully operated Arden House profitably or even sustainably without external subsidies. The Harriman family used railroad and investment wealth to maintain it briefly before abandoning the attempt. Columbia University subsidized operations for 55 years before surrendering. The Open Space Institute held it for 4 years, while desperately seeking a buyer. The Research Center has operated it for more than a decade with uncertain financial results. The building stands today as it stood in 1909. The granite remains solid. The rooms remain cavernous. The view remains spectacular, but the purpose remains unclear. E.H. Harriman built a house that outlasted him by a century but serves no function he would recognize. If you visit Arden House today, the tours mention American craftsmanship and architectural excellence. They rarely mention what the excellence cost. Chapter 9. The Legacy and the Lessons Unlearned. Arden House is remembered today as a triumph of American craftsmanship and architectural ambition. Tour materials emphasize that every element was American-made. They note the commissioned artwork and the innovative use of estate-quarried granite. They describe E.H. Harriman as a visionary who created something unprecedented. What they rarely mention is that the vision was unsustainable from the beginning. The house was too large, too expensive, and too impractical for anyone to maintain privately. 3 separate owners have discovered this truth. The workers who died building it discovered other truths. The current presentation focuses on architecture and history. The National Historic Landmark designation from 1966 recognizes the building's significance. Tours highlight the music room's medieval Great Hall proportions. The commissioned sculptures by Fraser and Rumsey, the American-only materials policy that distinguished Arden from European-inspired competitors. The narrative celebrates ambition and achievement. What the interpretation omits is systematic. Worker deaths during construction are never documented or memorialized. The names of men who fell from scaffolding or were caught in blasting accidents were not recorded. Their families received no compensation. No monument honors their sacrifice. The granite walls they built contain no acknowledgement of the price paid in blood and broken bodies. The environmental destruction receives similar silence. Creating the 50-acre plateau required removing portions of a mountain that had stood for millennia. Hundreds of tons of explosives shattered granite. The blast scars remain visible today for those who know what to look for. The mountain's profile was permanently altered to accommodate one man's vision of a house worthy of his wealth. The destruction was deliberate and irreversible. The true costs are mentioned carefully, if at all. Construction consumed approximately $2 million in 1900s currency, equivalent to roughly $60 million today. Annual maintenance required $200,000 in the 1910s and 1920s, approximately $6 million in current dollars. These figures are staggering even for families with railroad fortunes. They were never sustainable for private ownership. Adjusted for inflation, the total spent on building and maintaining Arden House from 1905 to 1950 likely exceeded $100 million in today's currency. The Harriman family fortune was sufficient to absorb this expense for 4 decades. But even vast wealth has limits. The costs eventually forced the family to surrender the property rather than sell it because no one would purchase such a burden. The pattern extended across Gilded Age estates. Vanderbilt's Biltmore in North Carolina could not be maintained by the family and eventually opened as a tourist attraction. The massive Fifth Avenue mansions of the Astors and Vanderbilts were demolished because operating costs exceeded any viable use. Newport's summer cottages passed to preservation societies when families could no longer justify the expense. Hudson Valley estates became institutions, museums, or ruins. The wealthy class that built these houses disappeared with surprising speed. Federal income taxes, implemented in 1913, changed wealth retention fundamentally. The stock market crash of 1929 eliminated many fortunes outright. Those that survived faced progressive taxation that made accumulating and maintaining dynastic wealth increasingly difficult. The era of private palaces ended not because taste changed, but because the economics became impossible. Labor costs escalated dramatically through the 20th century. The staff of 70 that Arden required in 1910 cost perhaps $100,000 annually. Similar staffing in 2000 would cost several million dollars annually. Heating technology improved, but fuel costs increased. Maintenance became more expensive as skilled craftsmen became scarcer and more costly. The economics that made Gilded Age estates possible reversed completely. Even institutional owners struggled. Columbia University maintained Arden for 55 years only by accepting continuous subsidies from general university funds. The conference center operations never achieved sustainability. The prestigious National Historic Landmark status created preservation obligations that increased costs. The university absorbed millions in losses before finally surrendering in 2007. The sustainability question raises uncomfortable issues that museums and tour guides prefer to avoid. Can we celebrate architectural achievement while acknowledging the waste it represented? Can we preserve beautiful buildings while admitting they were built on exploitation and excess? Can we tour gilded rooms while remembering the workers who died creating them? Arden House specifically illustrates the extreme. H. Harriman occupied it for 3 months before death. His widow Mary used it seasonally only. His son Averell could not afford to live there despite inheriting substantial wealth. Columbia University subsidized it for 55 years before admitting defeat. The current owner's financial sustainability remains uncertain after more than a decade. The mansion is beautiful. The granite walls demonstrate exceptional masonry. The commissioned artwork has genuine merit. The architectural concept was ambitious and largely successful. But the building serves no purpose that justifies its costs. It functions as a conference center because no alternative use works and because demolishing a National Historic Landmark is unacceptable. The house exists because it was built too solidly to collapse and because abandoning it would require admitting the entire project was a mistake. The broader legacy is equally troubling. Gilded Age estates like Arden represented concentration of wealth on scale that distorted society. Railroad barons and industrial magnates accumulated fortunes, while workers earned subsistence wages. The mansions they built announced their power, while workers died in construction accidents without compensation or acknowledgement. The contradiction between wealth and poverty, between marble halls and tenement housing, between ornate dining rooms and breadlines, defined the era. Progressive reformers understood these contradictions and fought to address them. Income taxes, labor laws, safety regulations, and social welfare programs emerged from recognition that unconstrained capitalism produced unacceptable outcomes. The estates that railroad barons built became evidence in the argument for regulation and redistribution. Arden House stands as monument to the excess that progressive reforms attempted to prevent. But the lessons remain contested. Some view Gilded Age mansions as cultural treasures deserving preservation and celebration. Others see them as monuments to exploitation that should be acknowledged honestly. The debate continues in how we interpret and present these properties today. Tours that celebrate craftsmanship while omitting worker deaths make choices about which history matters. Museums that display beauty while avoiding discussion of costs make implicit arguments about values. Arden House itself makes no argument. The building simply stands, granite walls as solid as when masons set them over a century ago. The rooms remain cavernous. The music room still suggests medieval greatness. The view from the mountain still commands the valley below. But the house serves purposes its builder never imagined and likely would not recognize. E.H. Harriman wanted a palace that would demonstrate American excellence. He succeeded. He created a building so excellent that no one could afford it. The railroad baron who had spent his life making bankrupt systems profitable could not make his own house sustainable. The mansion stands as proof that wealth, even vast wealth, has limits. The granite endures. The vision that created it does not. Arden House remains what it has always been, a magnificent monument to excess that exceeded even its creator's fortune. The workers whose labor built it were forgotten. The costs that maintaining it required defeated every owner. The purpose it was meant to serve disappeared within months of completion. What remains is stone and regret, beauty and waste, achievement and folly combined in equal measure and preserved because no one knows what else to do with it. Chapter 10. The Museum That Isn't. If you walk through Harriman State Park today and look up at Mount Orma, you can see Arden House perched on its granite ridge. The building is visible from hiking trails that wind through the 70,000 acres of protected forest. Park visitors photograph the mansion from below, attracted by its scale and remoteness. Most have no idea what they are looking at or what it cost to build. The Research Center on Natural Conservation operates Arden House with minimal public engagement. The property functions as a conference center, available for rental. Private events can be booked. Corporate retreats are accommodated. Environmental conferences are hosted periodically. But the house is not open for public tours. No historical interpretation is offered. No plaques explain what happened here or who died building it. The mansion exists in a strange category between private property and public landmark. The National Historic Landmark status theoretically makes Arden House nationally significant. The designation recognizes architectural and historical importance. But landmark status does not require public access. The Research Center maintains the building in compliance with preservation standards while keeping the public at a distance. The arrangement satisfies legal requirements while avoiding the expense and complexity of operating as a museum. This absence of interpretation creates a vacuum. The official narrative about Arden House, when it exists at all, focuses on architectural achievement and American craftsmanship. The story told is one of vision and excellence. E.H. Harriman wanted to demonstrate that American materials and American artisans could create something rivaling European palaces. He succeeded. The house stands as testament to that success. What remains unexamined is everything else. The worker deaths during construction are not documented in any accessible way. No memorial names the men who fell from scaffolding or were caught in explosions. Their families received no compensation at the time. Their descendants received no acknowledgement later. The blood price of building Arden has been erased as thoroughly as if it never existed. The environmental destruction similarly disappears from the narrative. 50 acres of mountain were blasted into rubble to create the plateau. The explosions permanently altered terrain that had existed for millennia. The scars are still visible on the mountain for those who know what to look for. But no interpretation explains what was destroyed or why. The granite walls are celebrated. The granite mountain they came from is forgotten. The financial unsustainability receives even less attention. Tour materials, when they exist, mention that Columbia University operated Arden as a conference center. They rarely explain that the university subsidized operations for 55 years at a loss of millions of dollars. The fact that the Harriman family gave the estate away because they could not sell it is omitted. The pattern of every owner struggling with costs is not discussed. The beautiful building's fundamental impracticality is treated as irrelevant detail. The sanitization serves multiple purposes. Current owners want to operate a functional conference center, not confront uncomfortable historical realities. Potential clients booking events prefer celebrating beautiful architecture to contemplating worker exploitation. Preservation advocates want to protect a significant building without acknowledging that its significance includes representing excess and waste. Everyone has reasons to prefer the simplified narrative. But the simplified narrative distorts understanding. Arden House is not merely an architectural achievement, it is evidence of how wealth operated during the Gilded Age. Railroad barons accumulated fortunes through methods that exploited workers and manipulated markets. They spent those fortunes on monuments to their own importance. The monuments required additional exploitation to build and proved impossible to sustain even for families with vast resources. The entire system was unsustainable economically and morally. Comparing Arden's treatment to other Gilded Age estates reveals patterns. Some properties have embraced more honest interpretation. The Tenement Museum in New York tells the story of immigrant workers who lived in conditions created by the same economic system that produced Fifth Avenue mansions. Some plantation museums in the South have begun acknowledging slavery's central role rather than focusing exclusively on architecture and gardens. The interpretive trend is moving toward complexity and honesty. Arden House has not made that transition. The building remains trapped between its past and present. It cannot be a private mansion because no one can afford that. It cannot be a profitable conference center because the economics do not work. It cannot be an honest museum because that would require confronting truths its current operators prefer to avoid. So it exists in limbo, beautiful and problematic, preserved and unexplained. The surrounding Harriman State Park provides ironic context. The 70,000 acres of protected forest exist because Mary Harriman donated land she could not afford to keep. The donation is remembered as generous philanthropy. The financial pressure that motivated it is forgotten. The park serves millions of visitors annually. They hike trails, swim in lakes, and enjoy nature preserved through what was fundamentally a distress sale by a wealthy family unable to maintain their holdings. The park's existence is genuinely valuable regardless of motivation. Protected forest provides public benefit, but understanding why it was protected matters. The donation was not simply generous. It was necessary. Even the Harriman fortune could not sustain owning 40,000 acres around a mansion that consumed hundreds of thousands annually in operating costs. The surrender of land was precondition for keeping the house even temporarily. The workers who built Arden House left no descendants who can speak for them. Most were immigrants who moved frequently seeking work. They had children who scattered across the country. The connection to Arden was severed within a generation. No one remains who can tell their stories or demand recognition. The silence is complete. The mountain itself is the most permanent victim. The summit was blasted away to accommodate human vanity. The rock was solid granite formed millions of years ago. It was destroyed in months using explosives. The plateau created by that destruction supports a building that has proven useless for most of its existence. The trade was permanent destruction for temporary utility. The asymmetry is profound. Contemporary visitors booking conferences at Arden House are unlikely to contemplate these issues. They appreciate the dramatic setting and impressive architecture. They hold their meetings and depart. The building serves its current purpose adequately. Whether that purpose justifies the costs of creation and maintenance is a question that goes unasked. The financial situation of the Research Center on Natural Conservation remains opaque. The organization does not publish financial statements or operating reports. How Arden House is funded is unclear. Whether conference revenue approaches operating costs is unknown. The pattern established by previous owners suggests subsidy is required. Whether that subsidy comes from the organization's endowment or external sources cannot be determined from public information. The COVID-19 pandemic's impact on operations demonstrated the fragility of the current model. Conference business evaporated overnight. The building sat empty while costs continued. How the research center managed this crisis is not publicly documented. The lack of transparency prevents assessment of long-term viability. What seems clear is that Arden House will continue existing because alternatives are unacceptable. Demolishing a National Historic Landmark would generate outrage. Allowing it to deteriorate would violate preservation law. Converting it to other uses faces physical and regulatory obstacles. The default becomes maintaining current operations indefinitely regardless of financial sustainability. This preservation by inertia creates a peculiar situation. The building is protected because it is protected. The circular logic satisfies legal requirements without resolving fundamental questions about purpose and value. Arden House remains because removing it is harder than keeping it, not because keeping it makes sense. E.H. Harriman built Arden House to demonstrate his power and taste. He succeeded in creating an impressive building. He failed to create anything sustainable or useful. The house has outlasted him by 115 years. It has outlasted his fortune's ability to maintain it. It has outlasted any clear purpose. What remains is a granite monument to ambition that exceeded practicality, wealth that exceeded wisdom, and vision that exceeded foresight. The building will likely stand another century. Whether anyone will remember why it was built or what it cost is less certain. The granite endures, the memory fades, the lessons go unlearned.